All right.
Hello, and welcome to the world's best Python bootcamp. My name is Angela, I'm a senior developer and the lead instructor at the Appbury, London's highest rated programming bootcamp. To date, I've taught over 500,000 students in person and online, and I'm so excited to be your instructor on this course. As a student on this course, you're going to get access to over 56 hours of HD video content, which contains step-by-step tutorials, interactive coding exercises, quizzes, and more. The course is structured around the 100 Days of Code challenge. So you can look forward to 100 days of lovingly crafted content that is going to cover every aspect of Python programming, from web development to data science. It's the only course you need to become a professional Python developer. Every day on the course, you're going to use what you've learned to build a new project. You'll build a bot that texts you in the morning if it will rain that day, so you never forget your umbrella again. You'll build classic arcade games like Snake and Pong to impress your friends by challenging them to a game that you built. You'll learn to make sense of complex data and create beautiful visualizations to impress your colleagues at work. You'll create a program that automatically sends happy birthday emails to your friends and family. Never forget mom's birthday again. You'll work on projects that clone real-world startups. Cheap Flight Club? Check. Build your own blog? Check. Twitter bot? Check. And there are so many more projects waiting to be discovered by you. 100 projects in total. So if you're somebody who wants to get a job as a Python developer, then this is perfect for building up your portfolio to show off at your next interview. Now, this course assumes absolutely no prior programming experience. So if you're somebody who's never coded before, I'll be with you every step of the way as I take you from programming fundamentals through to more intermediate and advanced programming concepts. You're going to learn Python from scratch. Now, if you're an advanced developer, on the other hand, then take a look at the curriculum and start at the level that suits you best. From beginner to professional, every level is covered in the course. Got school? Working a full-time job? Have to look after kids? I know you're busy. I've timed each day of the course to take less than 2 hours to complete, so you can fit the course around your life. This course has exactly the same curriculum as our in-person programming bootcamp. So instead of spending thousands of dollars and taking time off work, you'll get access to exactly the same curriculum with years of design and testing behind it to ensure that you don't just know what to do, but also why you're doing it. Now, don't just take my word for it. Check out what my past students had to say about my courses. Hi, this is where you start the course. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about it, because this is more than a course. It's a journey, and it's a challenge to yourself. I often hear people say, I want to learn to code, I want to become an app developer, I want a new job, I want to build my app. But without action, those words are meaningless. But you are different. I know it. Even though I don't know you personally, I know you've purchased this course and you haven't left it at that. You've made a start, and success comes to those who show up, and you showed up today. I know you can do this. You can make your dreams come true. You can change your own future, and you can change the lives of those people around you. One of the questions I hear most often is, what's the best way to learn to code? Well, here it is. It's the 100 Days of Code challenge. Code for at least an hour over 100 days. You're practicing a muscle to get strong at coding. Then the next question, inevitably, is, well, what do I do each day? And I've spent years thinking about this question. And finally, I'm now able to definitively answer that. It's this course. Every day, you're going to learn, and apply new programming concepts. After 100 days of repeating this process, not only will you have covered the entire professional Python curriculum, you'll also be so good that they can't ignore you. There are just 2 rules to get the most out of this course. 1, pledge to code for an hour a day for 100 days. To keep yourself accountable, I recommend downloading the course pledge. This is a contract with yourself. You can print it out and pin it somewhere you can always see, for example, above your computer or on your desk. By signing the pledge, you're making a commitment to yourself. It's only for you. No one else needs to see it. You can download the pledge in the course resources for this lesson. The second rule is to log your progress using the 100 Days of Code hashtag on Twitter. There are millions of other students who are on this journey with you, and they will support you when times get tough. I recommend tweeting your progress each day with the hashtag 100 Days of Code and search the hashtag on Twitter to see what others are doing as a part of their 100 days. And that's all there is to it. So here's to your success, and let's get started with the course. Hey guys, it's Angela here. After I made this course, I decided to take it myself so I could see what it's like to be in your shoes. Along the way, I realized there are things we could create to make your learning experience easier and even more enjoyable. So in this video, I'm going to share my top tips on how to use all the tools and resources we built for you. The first tip I have for you is to use another screen. That way, you can watch the lesson on a tablet or phone and code on your main computer. So you can code along with me and get practice instead of just listening to the videos. Programming is a practical skill, so just as you need practice when learning skateboarding, you also need practice to get good at programming. Tip number 2. I created a Python syntax cheat sheet, which you can download and print out. It contains some of the most common programming concepts we'll learn, and it's a handy reference to have when you're doing the coding challenges. You can download this in the course resources for this lesson, where you'll also find my 12 Rules to Learn to Code ebook. One of the hardest things about learning is keeping the motivation high. I find I'm usually more motivated when I'm in the library or a cafe where I can see other people studying or working hard. So I decided to create a 2-hour study with me video where I'm concentrating hard. We'll work for 25 minutes at a time and then take a 5-minute break before we get back to the next Pomodoro. Tip number 4. When you're learning new programming concepts, it's a good idea to note down how the code works while your mind is fresh on that topic. So I created a coding notes page that you can print out and collate to create a coding notebook. The note paper is the perfect place to write down examples of coding concepts you've learnt. It comes with line numbers and handy indentation guides, which is super useful when it comes to writing out Python code. Coding is not like history. There's nothing you need to memorize. It's a bit like baking. You don't need to remember the recipe. You just need to get practice and understand how to use the recipe. One of the most helpful note-taking systems for learning is the Cornell Note method. In our coding notebook, we've incorporated all the key elements from Cornell, including the sidebar, where you can write comments on each line of code, and the bottom summary section, where you can write an overview of the concept you just learned. In the course resources for this lesson, you'll also find some desktop wallpapers I've created for you. They contain some of the messages I keep around my desk to keep me motivated, and I hope they'll help you too. Tip number 5. Celebrate after you complete each day. Because this course is designed to take you from beginner to professional, as you go from day to day, there will be less and less tutorial and more practice. To keep you on track, I've created a 100 days of code poster. Once you complete a day, you can check it off on the poster. So print it out, put it up on a wall, and take each day as a challenge. Reward yourself after each day you tick off, and day by day, you'll learn and grow as a developer. This course is a safe space where you can make mistakes, ask questions, but most importantly, become confident in your skills as a programmer. I had so much fun building this course, and I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So here's to your success.
All right.
Hey guys, welcome to day 1 of your 100-day journey. And today we're going to learn about printing, commenting, debugging, string manipulation, and variables. So it's chock-a-block full of really fun stuff. And by the end of today, you will have created a band name generator program. So this is the final project of today. And the idea is that, let's say that your friend was starting a new band, a rock band or a classical band, and they're struggling to come up with a good name. So you come into the rescue and send them your band name generator program. So it asks you for the name of the city that you grew up in. So mine was Bristol in the southwest of the UK. And then it'll ask you what's the name of your pet. I had a pet rabbit when I was younger, and I am probably the least imaginative person, classic programmer personality. So I called my rabbit Rabbit. So now when I hit enter, it's going to give me my band name, and it could be Bristol Rabbit. So that sounds pretty cool. It could be like a rock band. So this is what you're going to make. And in the process, in order to create this, you're going to learn about printing, inputting, commenting, debugging, name errors, syntax errors, string manipulation, variables, and a whole lot more. So if you feel like you can already achieve this and you can prove it by making this program yourself, then feel free to skip to the next day's lessons. But for most of you, even if you've started learning Python programming, there's probably still a lot of new things that you'll find in today's lessons. Now, as with all the projects that we're making in this course, you get to try it out before you make it. So you can either go to the URL. Alternatively, if you don't want to type out the full URL, you can head over to the course content here and then click on the resources and click this link to head straight over there. And then once you're there, all you have to do is to click run, and you'll be able to preview how the final product is going to work. So you can type in your own city and follow the instructions until you get to the end result. So once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's get started and get coding straight away.
All right. I already have PyCharm.
Now, hopefully you've already got everything set up so that you're ready to go on the day 1 tasks, and you're able to see what I'm seeing right here. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, or if you don't have access to any of this, be sure to go back to the previous lesson where I showed you step by step how to download and get hold of the latest version of the curriculum exercises on PyCharm. So be sure you do that before you proceed so that we're all starting at the same place and you're seeing exactly what is shown in the videos. And we're ready to start learning how to program. Now, remember that the whole reason why we're learning to program is to be able to tell the computer what it needs to do and for it to follow our commands. So let's go ahead and tell the computer to do something. And we're going to do that by writing our first line of code. So in this case, I'm creating something called a print function, which is just the word print, all in lowercase, and then followed by a set of parentheses. Now, inside these parentheses, I'm going to tell it what I want it to print. And hopefully it's going to output that inside our console. So I'm going to start off by writing the classic hello world inside here. And then once you're ready, then go ahead and click run. After a few seconds, you should see the computer follow your command, namely printing the words that you told it to print inside the console or the output area over here. And once it's done, it indicates that by writing process finished with exit code 0, which means everything was successful, everything was run without any issues. Now, just to break down this area a little bit more for you, if you look at the top line here, which you'll always see, there's a lot of text in here, but it's actually very simple to understand. Essentially, it's telling you the location of the current file that is being run that has resulted in this output. So in our case, it's the day one task. And you'll see this change as you go through the different days because the location of this file where you wrote the code will change. So the first line is the location of the file that you executed. The second line, or multiple lines in between, is the result of your command to the computer. And then finally, at the very end, it tells you if the process finished with success, which is in this case, or if there are any other issues, it would show up here as well, which we're going to see very shortly. And to be sure that you're always running the current file, make sure that this drop-down is selected as current file. And that way, every time you press the play button here, it will run the code into the output area. Now, if you want to do a shortcut and you're really into keyboard shortcuts, you can hover over the play button and you'll see the shortcut on what I'm using, which is a Mac, is Control plus R. In Windows or Linux, it'll show up different shortcuts, but it should all show up there if you want to try that out. Alternatively, just keep pressing the play button and it works just as well. And the way that this command works is super simple. You have the keyword print, followed by a set of parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, you tell it what you want it to print. And once you've inserted that, then when this line of code gets executed by the computer, it'll know to simply print or output the thing that you've placed in between the parentheses. But notice here that it's not just the word hello world exclamation mark that I've put inside my parentheses. I've also added some quotation marks or double quotes around the word. And the reason why I've done this is so that I can tell the computer that this bit here in between the double quotes is not code. It's not like print where it's supposed to do something. This is just some text that I've made up that I want it to print out. And these pieces of text in programming lingo is known as strings. And you can imagine it as almost like a pearl necklace, right? It's a string of characters. And what the double quotes do is they basically show the beginning and the end of that string of characters. So that means you have to be really careful when you're typing. For example, if I go ahead and I miss out the closing double quote, well, now you can see that there's some changes that have happened to our code already. namely that the last parentheses, instead of being colored in white like the opening parentheses or how it used to be, it's now colored in green, the same color as the rest of our text or our string. And this is a subtle hint to us. You're going to get really attuned to these subtle hints because they are the clues that will tell you what might have gone wrong in your code. If I run this code as it is right now, it's going to break. It's going to give me a syntax error. And it says something that seems like it's completely not English. So, how can we figure out what this means? Now, the thing I want you to know is that all programmers make mistakes. We all make lots of errors, like forgetting to add the double quotes at the end of the string, or forgetting to add a closing parentheses. These things are just common errors because we're human. But the thing that differentiates great programmers is we're really good at figuring out what the problem is and how to fix it. So you can imagine that coding is just a whole bunch of problems that you have to solve. And in this case, when we get some sort of red text and our code is not doing what we expect it to do, then all we have to do is take this entire error message where it says something, something error, and this is some sort of message that we're supposed to understand. And we're simply going to drop it into Google. And usually the first link you come across will be from a website called stackoverflow.com. And this is basically the Q&A website that all developers will go to whenever something is wrong with their code or when they can't figure out how to do something. So if we click on this link, you can see that somebody else has also had this error. And some kind souls have told us that the solution might be the fact that you're missing a double quote before the end of the line. So if we take a look back at our code, the code that generated this error looks like this. And indeed, we are missing a double quote at the end of our string. As you're learning to code, as you're going through your 100 days, I want you to become more and more attuned to the color of your code. Because one of the most helpful things that code editors such as this do for us is something called syntax highlighting. For example, when I was missing that double quote, it highlighted this entire thing. And that is basically it telling us it seems like this whole thing is some text. It thinks that all of this is a string and that we're missing a closing parenthesis. So if you notice this and you're like, wait, actually, that's not right, this part should match the color of the open brace, which is white. So there must be something wrong here. And indeed, if you have a look at the error message, it actually has a little caret sign right here showing you that there's something that's probably not right here. And it might jog your memory that, oh, yeah, I've forgotten a closing double quote. Now, the really handy thing about PyCharm is it actually underlines your errors before you even run your code. And if you hover over the underline, it usually gives you some intelligent guess as to what your problem might be. And in this case, it's absolutely spot on. It says you're missing a closing quote, which is exactly what we're missing. So that will also be really helpful for us to figure out what it is that we need to do. But as with all things with AI, if we don't know what we're doing in the first place, these hints don't help us that much. For example, if I put the closing quote right here, I've got other problems and I'm going to create more problems for myself. So it's important that we first understand how things work and then use technology and AI to help us, such as in this case, to fix our bug. Now, you'll notice that there is also a tiny squiggly line under this closing brace. But in this case, it's not in red, so it's not an error, but instead it's in yellow, which is a warning. Now, most of these warnings come from a good standard practice for how to write code. And if we hover over this warning, it tells us that PEP 8, which is guidance for how to write Python code, and it tells you that the problem that it's seeing is there's no new line at the end of the file. Now, we can ignore all of this because it's a bit too complicated, and it's actually very simple to solve this problem. All it's saying is that in good practice, when we're writing Python code, there should be a new line at the end of the file so that we have our cursor down here instead of ending right there. And that's all there is to it. And with that one thing, we've gotten rid of all our errors, we've gotten rid of all our warnings. Our code looks good stylistically as well as syntactically. All these big words that all that it means is that it looks great in every single way. And we've got our little check mark, which means no problems found by the editor. Now, sometimes the editor can be really picky, and some of the things that it tells you, you can safely ignore. But as always, we need to understand how everything works before we can do that. So now that we've embarked on our first step to write some code and start commanding the computer to do what we want it to do, which is to print out some words into the output area, it's now time for a challenge. So head over to the next lesson and we're going to test you on what you've learned in this lesson by practicing writing some print statements. So for all of that,
Yeah, I've already done this before, but
All right, guys, let's get back to learning about a few more things that we can do with strings. You saw in the last lesson that if we wanted to print things on individual lines, then we actually had to write them a few times, right? We had to write print on 3 lines if we wanted it to be printed 1, 2, 3, like so. Now, in this lesson, I want to show you a method where we can do the same thing, but by using a single print method. So saving ourselves a few characters. So the way that we would create a new line is by writing a backslash and the N character. And now if I go ahead and write hello world again afterwards and I hit run, and you can see that once that line of code has been executed, I've got hello world printed on 2 separate lines, separated by this backslash N character, which gets replaced by a new line. So go ahead and give that a go and see if you can create another one. Remember though, it's a backslash and not a forward slash, but the syntax highlighting should help you.
Looks like
All right, we can simply just add another backslash N. And remember that unless you want a space to appear right before where your hello world appears, you actually don't want any gaps between each of these lines. There we go. We've got the same result as before, but now using only a single print statement and creating some new lines with the backslash N. Now, one of the other things that we can do with strings is we can concatenate them. What this means is we combine different strings so that they will be added to the end of another string. Here's an example. Let's say that we had the word hello, and I wanted to add my name to the end of this word to make it a single string. Well, I can combine 2 strings by simply using a plus sign. So I can write hello plus Angela. Now, here's a question. When this runs, what do you think it will look like? Do you think it'll write hello space Angela or hello Angela all in one word? Let's see what happens. You can see that these 2 strings have now been combined into one. And there's no space in between because we don't have a space character anywhere in here. Pause the video and see if you can add a space in between.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd imagine so.
All right, so there's 2 ways that you can do this, or maybe 3 actually. You could add a space to the end of hello, you could add a space to the beginning of Angela, or you can actually continue using string concatenation by simply adding another string in between these two, and this one is just a space. So now when I run my code, you can see the space gets inserted, and this long thing gets combined into a single string that looks like this once this bit of the code gets executed. If we think of strings as a string of connected characters, then string concatenation is simply taking those separate strings of characters and merging them into one. Now, this is a good point to mention that in Python programming, spaces are really, really important. And what I mean by this is not so much the spaces that are inside strings like this one, but the spaces that you add in your code. So here you can see that the print statement starts at the very beginning of this line 2. But what happens if I add a space before the print statement? Now you can see I've got the editor screaming at me already. I've got errors, I've got squiggly lines, and if I run this code as it is, I'll get something that's called an indentation error. Now this is different to the previous error we had, which was a syntax error. Now, what this error tells you is that there is an unexpected indent around this part of your code. That's what the error message is telling me. So we can then go and investigate and see our squiggly lines, and we can hopefully realize that, oops, we've added an extra space, which we can easily get rid of, and it will calm everything down and get rid of that error. So remember, previously we were missing a closing quotation mark and we got a syntax error. And in this case, we have a indentation error by either adding in an aberrant space or accidentally inserting even a whole tab, which is created using the tab key. And all of these things will give you indentation errors. So it's really important that you be careful when you're adding spaces in your Python code. It doesn't matter so much when we have spaces in between the quotation marks, because that's a part of the string. But anywhere that is a part of the code, so in this case, anything that's not green, and you go ahead and add some spaces, you might end up with an indentation error. Now, you might also, when you add spaces in your code, not have an indentation error because the code can function. For example, if I add a space between print and the parentheses. But in this case, nothing really changes in terms of our output. But we do get a warning because this is not really ideally how we should format our code. So our warning tells us that according to PEP 8 and best practices, there shouldn't be white space before an open parenthesis. So we can also use that hint to get rid of any of these issues. So the message here is be careful when you're adding spaces. Make sure you know what it's doing. And when you see the error indentation error, remember what you learned in this lesson to be able to fix it. Now, as helpful as these warnings and errors are, you'll notice that I'm putting a lot of emphasis on looking at the errors that come out after we hit run. And that's because this comes from the Python compiler itself. This will be the same whenever you write Python code. However, these squiggly lines and these errors that you get when you hover over them are specific to the editor that we're using here, which is PyCharm. Now, if you happen to be using a different type of editor, they might not give you the same kind of warnings and they might not give you the same kind of errors. And the messages will also be wildly different. So it's always really important to learn the errors that you get back after you run your code and to remember these words, syntax error or indentation error. And this is something that will help you no matter what tools you use, making you a more flexible developer. And we're going to see this in practice right now because I've got a debugging exercise coming up for you right after this lesson. And we're going to be doing it inside a different editor without the assistance of all of these helpful squiggly lines. So can you rely on your skills, your ability to debug when you run your code and see error messages and go through each of the lines of the debugging exercise one by one and fix each problem from top to bottom? This word debugging actually comes from a story where back in the 80s, a moth actually flew into one of the early computers and it got electrocuted, unfortunately, for the moth. And for the programmer, it meant that his code wasn't performing as he would expect it to. So he actually had to go into the computer, pick out the moth, and fix the wires so that it would work again. Now, we don't have any moths flying around in our code, thankfully, but what we do have to do is we have to pick out the errors so that our code will run in the way that we expect it to, without any errors. So head over to the next lesson and try out your first debugging exercise. Now, if you head over to task number 3 in today's set of exercises, you'll see the code that we had from previously. And today, I want to talk about a different function. So we've seen the print function and all the things that we can do to strings and use the print function and debug it. But what if we wanted to be able to enter some data? So if we wanted to say, ask the user, what is your name? And when we run this code, you can see that being printed. But there's no way for the user on this side to be able to give our code some data to work with. In order to do that, instead of using the print function, we're going to use a different function, and it's called the input function. And notice how, as I'm typing, Code Intelligence is already giving me some suggestions because it thinks it knows what I might want, and it's right. So this is what the input function looks like. This is the name of the function, and again, it's followed by some parentheses. Inside the parentheses is the prompt that I'm going to give the user. So when I run this code, it will say, what is your name? Now, this time, you'll notice a couple of differences. Firstly, it doesn't have that final line process finish with exit code 0. It's actually not saying anything at all. Plus, when you look up here, you'll see that in addition to the play button, there's the stop button being highlighted, and the play button has changed this rerun symbol. So, what does all of this mean? Well, it means that we're actually in the middle of the process of running our code. It hasn't exited yet. And what exactly is it waiting for? Well, it's waiting for us to click into this output pane and actually type in an input. So the prompt is the text that goes into the input command. And then afterwards, we can add some actual input, whatever it is we want, into the output area. And now once I hit enter, you'll see that finally we have the process finished with exit code. You'll see the stop button is gone, and we can now rerun the code as usual. But where did this text go, and how can we capture it? The input function looks pretty much identical to the print function, but instead of the word print, it's just got the word input. And inside the parentheses, instead of adding what text will be printed, we're adding the prompt for the user to give them a hint as to what kind of data we want. And then when you run this code, it will print out the prompt, but then there will be a cursor. In some places, you'll see it like a flashing cursor. Other places, it'll just be a solid cursor. And in some places, you won't even see a cursor until you click into the output area, ready for the user to type in some piece of data. So what can we do with this data? Well, we can use it inside our code. Now, the way that this works is when this line is run by the computer, it takes your command as understanding that you want the user, so somebody to be able to, you want the user to be able to type in an input into this area. And whatever it is they type, you're going to take it back into the code and replace this command with it. So this is a little bit abstract when we see it like this, but let's imagine we wanted to write a print statement and we wanted to say hello and we wanted to greet the user. Now, I know that in my case, my name is Angela, so I would get it to say hello, Angela. But what if you didn't know the name of your user? Well, you wouldn't just want to say hello, user, or hello, something generic. You would want them to be able to type in their name. So this is where a little bit of string concatenation comes in, which we learned before. If we take this input function that we've explored just now, and we paste it into this print statement. So this can be a little bit confusing, so just concentrate right here. There's two parentheses at the end. And the reason for this is because this first one closes off the print statement. So we're saying everything between here and here, we want it to be printed. Now, what is in between there? Well, firstly, it's the string that says hello, and then a space, and then what we had as the input. So whatever the user types into here will replace this highlighted part, and we'll end up with hello, concatenate, so add to another string. So let's try this out. Let's go ahead and hit run. And you can see the prompt show up in the output area. So now if I click into this area, my cursor starts flashing and I can type whatever it is I want. Now when I hit enter, what I type is going to go and replace this input function. And then once it's in there, the print function is going to carry out its role, and it's going to add the word hello in front of it and then print it out right here. So we can see now, hello, Angela. But this is, of course, making our code a lot more adaptable. So if tomorrow I decided to change my name to Cherry, there's a really embarrassing story about this. So when I first moved to the UK, I wanted to pick my own name because I was 9 years old and I wanted a very fruit-related name. And this was the name that I wanted. And my parents, as wise as they are, said, no, we will pick your name. So that's how I ended up with the name Angela. So now you can see this gets added in to the hello, and we can have a completely adaptable bit of code. So now it's time for a small challenge. Can you use what you've learned from previous lessons and also this lesson to figure out how to add a exclamation mark to the end of the sentence that's being printed? So instead of just hello, Angela, we want the output to say hello, and then we take in whatever it is user inputs into here, and then we replace that with the user input, and finally we add an exclamation mark. Now, of course, we have to do this using strings and using what we've learned about Python code. So pause the video, read the description of the problem, and see if you can solve it. Okay, so if you remember from string concatenation, what we need to do is we need to treat this input function as its own string because eventually it's going to be replaced by a string. So we can take that part, set it aside, and then we can use the plus sign to concatenate the final character, which is a exclamation mark to this entire long string. So now if I go ahead and run this code, and I type in an input, that input gets inserted and replaces this entire input function. And then finally, I get the exclamation mark added to the end. If you find this line of code difficult to understand and to wrap your head around, then I recommend heading over to a website called thonny.org and downloading an application called Thonny. It's completely free and it's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And once you've installed this application, you can go ahead and paste your line of code here and click on this little debug symbol. And then we can click on this button, which is called the Step Into button, to step into the execution of this line of code to see how the computer is evaluating this code here step by step. So you'll see the first thing it tries to do is it will try to run this print statement. It looks inside these parentheses to see what it needs to print. So the first thing is this hello, and it turns that into a string. And then it looks at the next thing after the plus sign to see what it should turn this into. And this, of course, is the input function. So as I continue stepping into it, it's actually going to execute it. So it's going to run this input function and show the prompt, what is your name? So that's what shows up down here. And now if I enter a value in here and hit enter, then that value that I put right there replaces that previous input function and is now held inside the print statement. So if I continue stepping through this code, then you'll see it concatenates all of the pieces together. And finally, it just ends up with a simple
I'm getting there.
print, hello, Angela, exclamation mark. And if I continue stepping into it, you'll see that line of code executed until there are no more
Would you do 1.5?
instructions left. So if you prefer seeing your code run like this step by step so that you can see what's going on, then I recommend giving this a go. As you're learning to code, there's going to be new concepts covered. There's going to be things that take a little bit of thinking before you can understand it. So what a lot of programmers love to do is they like to comment in their code. Now, you might have seen this already throughout the coding exercises and the solutions I provided. But in Python, if you wanted a line of text to not be considered by the computer at all you have to do is add the hashtag or pound sign in front of your text. And this turns it into a comment. So something that the computer will completely ignore. So in here, you can write code as much as you like, but it won't be executed. And when you click run, you'll see that this is completely ignored. What I recommend is whenever you come across a new concept in the course, to make a comment above it so that you can explain to yourself what's actually going on in the line of code below. This way, the next time you come across this line of code and you're not quite sure what's actually happening here, you can have a look at the notes that you've written for yourself in your own words, and hopefully it'll re-jog your memory and make it much easier to comprehend what's going on. In addition to adding a pound sign manually, you can also highlight a line of code or simply have your cursor on a line of code and hold down Command and / if you're on Mac, or Control and / if you're on Windows. And what this does is it takes this line of code out of the computer's awareness, and it's no longer executed when you run this code file. So the process is finished without anything being carried out at all, because all the computer is seeing is a blank page, because we've taken all the code out into comments. So in order to take this back into code, all you have to do is use the same command that you tried just now. So Command / on Mac or Control / on Windows. And this will now again be considered as code by the computer. All right. So in this lesson, we learned about the input function, we learned about putting functions inside other functions and being able to get user input from the console by using the input function. And if you've commented this line of code thoroughly and you fully understood how it works, then you'll be able to breeze through the next exercise. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Now, in this lesson, I want to talk to you about Python variables. And it's a really, really useful concept. The first thing I want to do is to take a look at this line of code that you should have already. And when we run this, we should be pretty familiar with what happens, right? It will ask us for our name. And when we hit enter, nothing happens. But behind the scenes, this name or this input has now been received by this function. But once that's done, it kind of just disappears, right? And there's no way for us to be able to refer to it in the future. Or is there? Well, this is where variables come in really handy. If I give the result of this action a name, well, then I'll be able to refer to it later on. So at the beginning of the line, I'm going to call it name, and then I'm going to add an equal sign. And what this does is it assigns whatever it is that the user typed in as the input to this prompt to a variable called name. So now, if I go ahead and run my code again and I enter a name, now once I hit enter, normally there's no way for me to get hold of this anymore, right? But now I can actually go ahead and write print. I'm going to print the value of this variable name. So now if I run my code and I write a name, hit enter, you'll see that this gets printed. And I can use this at any point in my code just by referring to the name that's attached to this value. So it's almost like we've saved the data from this action to a name. And if you think about it, if you had a phone book, let's say, and you just jotted down the numbers of people, the next time you look at this, there's no way for you to know whose number that is, right? In a sense, it's the same thing with the computer. Even though we've inputted this piece of data, there's no way for us to be able to refer to this data unless we give it a name. So in our phone book, we might say that this particular number is associated with the name James. And in programming, we would call this name James a variable. So we could write something like James equals and then his phone number. And this means that in the future, if we ever need this piece of data, we can just refer to it by its name, the variable name of James. Now, as the name variable suggests, it's something that can be changed or can be varied. So, for example, just because this name is set to something up here doesn't mean that I can't change it later on. So, to make things simple, let's go ahead and delete the input function and let's just say name is equal to Jack. Print name. When I run that, Jack is what gets printed inside the console because I'm now referring to that piece of data by the variable name. But if later on I decide to give this variable a different piece of data to hold on to, let's say Angela, and I print name at this time point after I've changed it, what do you think these two lines will print? What do you think will first be printed? What do you think will be printed second? So even though they're both printing the same variable, at this point, when we first call print, it's holding on to the value of Jack. But by line 5, I've now changed it so that it's holding on to the value of Angela. So to practice that, I have a challenge for you. So I want you to be able to figure out how many characters are in the name that the user types in using the input function. So you already know how the input function works. You already know how to get the user to enter it and then to get that data back into our code and print it out. But here's the extra step. Can you calculate how many characters there are in the name that they type in? For example, if they typed in Jack, that would be 4. If they typed in Angela, that would be 6. Now, how do we figure out things when we're programming and we're trying to do something that we haven't done before? Well, one of the most important skills as a programmer is to be able to use Google well, is to be able to find the answers that you need, because it's inevitable that you won't remember every single function and you won't know every single function. So we need to read documentation and we need to know how to get hold of it. So very simple, we start off with our query, how to find the length of a string, and then we add our programming language because this will be different in every programming language. So normally just add Python to the end of it. And then once we hit enter, normally we'll get hold of some form of documentation, and the W3 Schools documentation for Python is not bad. And you can also browse through all of the other examples. So normally for Python, I stick to W3 Schools or Stack Overflow, and both of these will give you the right answer. But if we are reading documentation, then you can see that normally there's a whole bunch of other things that we can look up, just like a dictionary of Python. Now, as you wouldn't start with a dictionary when you're learning a new language, believe me, I tried that, it did not work. You also wouldn't want to learn through everything in the documentation because it's very dry. And when you don't have a real life application, when you're not trying to use a particular function or some sort of component, then you also don't remember it very well. So I recommend to find what you need when you need it. And our brain is for thinking and not for storing, because these days, as you know, it's super cheap to buy a single terabyte storage hard disk online. I think it costs something like $10 or $20, and it's just getting cheaper every day. So don't use your brain to store things, use it to think. But coming back to our documentation here, in order to get the Python string length, we use the len function. And just like the print function, it's an inbuilt function in Python. So we can simply just write len, and then we can use whatever it is we want to measure. For example, in this case, it's hello world, and it will output the number of characters in that string. So now give it a go yourself. So the pause1 is the instruction set, and I want you to get user input. I want you to take that user input and calculate the length of the string that the user inputted, and finally to print that number out into the output area. And everything could be done in just one line of code. So try to find the documentation, try to figure out how to do this, and I'll see you on the other side where we run through the solution. So pause the video now. All right, so referring to the documentation, it's pretty straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to get hold of the input. So we know the input function looks like this, and we can add in whatever prompt we want. So what is your name? And then we're going to wrap this input inside another set of parentheses. And you can do that without having to type open and closing brackets. If you just highlight the entire line you want to wrap and then type the open bracket, and it should wrap everything inside. So the next step is to calculate the length, which is using the len function that we just heard about. And then finally, I'm going to wrap everything in just one more bracket. And this one is the print function. So the three steps are: we get hold of the user input, we calculate the number of characters in that input, and then finally, we print it out into the output area. So now let's go ahead and run our code. So first line that comes out is these two print statements from before. And then the third line asks me, what is my name? And you can see the process is paused, waiting for me to type that in. And then once I hit enter, that name is going to replace this part of our code, and it's going to calculate the length. And then finally, that length is going to be printed, and we get 6, which is correct. That's the number of characters in my name. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about documentation and also search, and also the importance of being able to get your own answers as a programmer. So now I have another coding challenge for you. Can you use what you've learned about creating variables and using variables in order to take these two parts, the input function and the output of the len function, and store them in separate variables? So there should be a variable called username that will store whatever the user enters into the input area. And then using that variable, you're going to create a variable called length to calculate the length of the username. So then instead of this combined print statement, we can end up with simply just printing length at the end. So that way we can get the same result as this, but we use several steps to get there by creating and using some variables. So give this a try, pause the video, and if it doesn't work, come back and we'll go through the solution together.
Cool.
Okay, so the first step is we're going to create our first variable, which is called username. And this is simply going to be set to store whatever the user types into the input. And that will get stored under this reference, username. And then we're going to use that to calculate the length of the username. But instead of putting the input into the length, we can now refer to it using our variable name, username. So now we can print this new variable that we created on line 9. And through these 3 steps, we've made this one single line code, hopefully a little bit easier to understand. So we get the username from the input, we calculate the length from the username, and then finally we print the length. And when we hit run, you'll see exactly the same thing happens. We get the same code. Now, at this point, you might be wondering to yourself, what exactly is the point of variables? We've just turned one very, very short line into 3 very long lines. Now, of course, we're working with very, very simple examples here, and it might be hard to see the exact use case. But as things get more complicated, you will be glad to know how to use variables. Even in this simple situation, you can see that instead of this line of code, having these 3 lines of code makes our code a lot more readable because we're labeling each step of our code. We're saying, well, from this line of code, we're going to get hold of the username. From this line of code, we're going to work out the length of the username. And then finally, we're going to use that final variable and print it out. Now, as things get more complex, and being able to split up code into smaller modules will become a lifesaver. So, in the next lesson, I've got a coding exercise for you, and hopefully, through more and more examples, you'll see just how useful variables can be. Right now, bear with me and just try to learn to create variables and use variables. And I promise it's going to all become very, very clear very soon just how useful they are. Now, when it comes to naming your variables, you can pretty much call it whatever it is you want. So instead of calling this name, I could have just called it N. I could have called this L. And as long as I'm consistent, so if I wanted to get the length of N, then I would have to change this as well. And if I wanted to print out L, then I have to change this as well. But there's a couple of rules that you should probably follow. And the most important one is to make your code readable. Because if you come back to this in 6 months, 12 months, N and L is not going to have a lot of meaning for you. So try to make sure that it actually makes sense to you. And if you want to, you can actually have multiple words in the name of your variable. So, for example, if you wanted to call this username, then you would write the word user and then you would separate each of the words with an underscore. But you can't have a space in between. This is not valid code. And if you try to run it, you'll get a syntax error. So the name of the variable has to be one single unit. And in order to separate words in Python, we use the underscore. Now, if you want to use numbers in the name of your variable, you can. So, for example, length 1, length 2, but they can't be at the beginning of the name of the variable. So you can't say 1 length or 3 length. That will generate a syntax error as well. Finally, there's certain privilege words that we use. For example, the names of our functions like print and input. And it's usually good practice to not use them as the names of your variables because you can see that syntax highlighting gets messed up because it thinks that it's actually an input function you're trying to create. And even though often when you run your app, it might not have any issues, this is really bad practice because it's very confusing. So try to make sure that all the names of your variables get highlighted like the other variables in the same color. Now, the final thing to remember is that if you decide to call your variable this particular name, NAME, and at a later point you make a typo and you spell it wrong. So maybe instead of name, you said Nama. This is not going to work. And when you run your code, you'll get what's called a name error because it says this name is not defined. And the idea is that you would look at where the error is, line 2, print NAME, and you'll see, oh, that's not right. It's meant to be spelled NAME. So you'll have to go and fix it in order for your code to work. Now, remember that this is not because Python is doing any sort of spell checking for you. It's like, oh, that's not how you spell name. No, in fact, if you decided to call this NAME and you later on use it as NAME, there's no problems. Other than this green squiggly underline, which tells you that there is a typo in this word, Python doesn't actually care, and that's why your file is still checked, because very often you might be in the situation where you need to create something that is unique, right? You might have a player in your video game called Nama, and you decide to call it that. It's totally up to you. And the only thing that Python really cares about is that you are consistent. This is the name that's associated with this piece of data. Later on, when you want to use this piece of data, you use this name to refer to it. And as long as these two spellings are identical, then the computer doesn't care at all. So when you get a name error in your code, you now know it's probably because you've misspelled or mistyped one of the variable names somewhere in your code. Now, in the next lesson, I prepared a quiz for you where you'll get to select which variable names are valid and which ones are not good practice. Have a go at that over on the next lesson. All right, guys, it's time for the final project of today. So the program that you're going to be building looks a little bit like this, and you can check it out if you head over to this link, either by typing it in or heading to the course resources page and clicking on the corresponding link. But essentially, it's a band name generator, and it asks you for a city that you grew up in and the name of your pet, and then it combines those together and gives you the name of your band. There's a couple of things to note here. Firstly is notice when this input got triggered, the cursor actually showed up on a new line. So if I run this again, you can see it says, what's the name of the city you grew up in? And then the cursor is on the next line. And what I want you to do is to go ahead and head over to this starting project. So there's a couple of steps in here as hints, but the important thing is once you've completed this project, it should work exactly the same as the one that you see here. And in order to do this, you're going to have to apply everything that you learned today, including printing, inputs, variables, new lines, string manipulation, debugging, and a whole lot more. So this is the time to grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee, pause the video, and tackle this final project.
get a greeting. Let's see. They grew up in and stored in a variable city. City. It has to be on a new line. Name of a pet. Make sure we have a space. Oh. All right, looks good to me.
All right. Or if there's something that you're unsure about, then continue watching and I'll go through the solution with you. The first step is to create a greeting for your program. In our case, it says, welcome to the band name generator. So that's exactly what I'm going to create. And we print these messages using the print function. So I'm going to say, welcome to the band name generator. And this, when I run it, will just print that message. Now, the next step is to ask the user for the city that they grew up in. So in order to get some input from the user, we'll need, of course, the input function. And we're going to ask them using the prompt, which goes inside the parentheses, which city did you grow up in? So now when I hit run, it's going to ask me for the city that I grew up in, and I'm able to add a reply, like so. Now that data is just going to be lost to thin air unless I capture it and I give it a name. So I'm going to have to create a variable to hold on to the data that the user inputted. So we'll just call that city and then add the equal sign to assign whatever it is that the user typed in to this variable name. And now I have access to the city variable and I can print it or use it later on if I want to, like so. Now, the next step is to ask the user for the name of a pet. So we'll call that variable pet and we'll assign it the value that the user input for what is the name of a pet. Now, step 4 is to combine the name of the city and the pet and show them their band name. Now, there's quite a few ways of doing this, especially if you look around on the internet. But the way that you learn in today's lessons is using string concatenation. So we're going to do that. So we're going to use a print statement and tell them your band name could be, and then we're going to add the name of the city and then add a space and then add the name of their pet. So now when we run our code, it will ask us for the name of their city and then the name of a pet. And then it should combine those together and show us the name of our band. Now, the final step is that the input cursor should show on a new line like this. So here's the cursor, but here's the input, just so that you get a bit of space and you're not typing it in directly after the prompt here, like what we have. So how do we do that? Well, you learned about modifying strings by creating a new line using the \n. And we can add that both to the end of the city input and the pet input. And now when we run our code, you'll see that the cursor now shows up on the next line and our program looks a lot better. So there you have it. This is how you solve this boss challenge. And this is how you create the band name generator project. So I hope you had fun with me today learning Python and a lot of the fundamentals of Python. And tomorrow, I've got another jam-packed module of really awesome tutorials and code challenges and projects for you to sink your teeth into. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. So have a rest now and let your brain work on the things that you learned while you sleep. And I'll see you here bright and early. Good night and see you tomorrow.
Well done. You've just completed your first day. And remember that a journey of 1,000 miles can't begin without the first step. So congratulations on doing that and completing it. Now, remember that the first few days might take a little bit longer than an hour to complete, just because I've got so much to teach you and so much to cram into each of these days. So it doesn't matter if you need to take a break in between or if you need to take a nap in between even. Just come back to it whenever you can, and you don't have to do it strictly in the day-by-day order. Now, my hope is that you'll keep going and you'll come back tomorrow refreshed and you'll tackle the next day's subjects with the same vigor that you did today. So have a good rest and I'll see you tomorrow.
Easy enough.
Hey guys.
All right. End of day 1. Next up, day 2. See ya.